Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm so happy to welcome you here this evening to our program with Professor Jonathan Boyarin, author of Yeshiva. Oh gosh, it just went out of my head. He's going to tell us Yeshiva Days. I was thinking Yeshiva Boys, Yeshiva Studies, but it's Yeshiva Days, of course. And I just want to tell you a little bit about him. First of all, he's the Mann Professor of Modern Jewish Studies at Cornell University. His work centers on Jewish communities and on the dynamics of Jewish culture, memory, and identity. And he has investigated these fields in a range of ethnographic projects set in all sorts of places around the world, from Paris, Jerusalem, to the Lower East Side. He has published multiple books: Jewish Families, Mourning at the Stanton Street School, A Lower East Side Summer, The Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and the Identity of Christian Europe. And he's done a whole lot of other really incredible things, some of which we're going to learn about tonight, actually. So you don't want to hear from me. You definitely want to hear from the professor. So I'm going to turn things over to you now. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Boyarin. Welcome.
Thank you, Alyssa. And I do have a slideshow. I've been dragged and kicked. I've been dragged, kicking, and screaming into the 21st century. That's right. That's how we say it. But my pictures recall, at least my first pictures recall an earlier time. If you ask a lot of American Jews what their first image is when you say Lower East Side, they're very likely to come up with something that looks like this and might in fact be precisely this, a tenement, a classic tenement. And actually, some of you may have even seen this building, because this is the building that houses the central permanent exhibit of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum at 97 Orchard Street. If you say Lower East Side, maybe you'll also think of pickles. And there are still excellent pickles available on the Lower East Side. Maybe herring in barrels. If you don't remember that, you've seen those photos too. So tenements and the foods and smells we associate with them are certainly a site of nostalgia, but they were awful housing. And they are the reason that our people left the Lower East Side, often as quickly as they could. Now, not everybody who had the means to leave the Lower East Side earlier in the 20th century wanted to do so for various reasons. Maybe they had businesses nearby, jobs. Maybe they remained sentimentally attached. And so this building, with the lofty name Egeloff Towers at the corner on Avenue A between 3rd Street and 4th Street, was built in 1929 for the Jewish upper middle class of the Lower East Side. I don't have really good photos of the entranceway and lobby here, but if I tell you that my spouse, Alyssa Sampson, says it's decorated in the style that she calls Semitic deco, that might suggest something to you, with the sort of Assyrian lions and so forth in gilt and so forth. Alyssa and I moved into this building in December of 1979 and stayed for just about 40 years. Fortunately, we were able to move into progressively larger apartments in the same building. It's certainly, there will be no other place where I will live longer in my lifetime. It is, I said, 3rd Street and Avenue A. So if you know the neighborhood, that's the upper edge of today's Lower East Side. Or if you want to call it that, you could call it the East Village. I met somebody here in Washington Heights this morning, an older gentleman, and I said 3rd Street, and he said, oh, that's not the Lower East Side. So It's about a mile from the old Forward building on East Broadway. And in fact, when Alyssa and I first moved into the Egloff Towers, there was nothing as tall between our building and the Forward building a mile away. So the Lower East Side was traditionally a low-rise district. And it's certainly not true today. There are plenty of new glass and metal towers, including the Essex Crossing development along Delancey Street. They tower over the old tenements and the old shuls, those of them that are left. And one of the buildings they tower over, that's one of the glass towers, right? And one of the buildings they tower over is the Stanton Street Shul. Now, Stanton Street is 1 block south of Houston, parallel on east-west street, between Clinton Street and Attorney. This is typical of the architecture that we call tenement shuls. We call them tenement shuls not just because they were built for people who lived in tenements, but because they had to fit into tenement lots. In fact, the Stanton Street shul is only 20 feet wide. Now, Rabbi Mendelson, I'll bet your shul is wider than 20 feet, even if it's small.
Barely, but definitely wider than 20 feet.
There you go. Actually, 20 feet is narrower than the legal minimum for a lot, even in those days. I started going there, I know the date, November 9th, 1983. And I found there a very Hamish older generation of immigrants and elderly people who'd lived there all their lives and had modest careers working in places like the Campbell Soup Factory or as professional door hangers and so forth, not fancy people. And the congregation then was led by Rabbi Joseph Singer, himself an immigrant from Czechoslovakia in the late 1930s, known as the Pilsner Rav. He's dead about 20 years, and I still consider him my Rebbi to the extent that I have one, a very, very special man. That Hamish older crowd, however, was replaced over the years that we were there by a younger group. And today the Stanton Street Shul is thriving, contentiously, not easily, and it's still Orthodox, but at Stanton Street, they push the boundaries on several areas, especially with regard to questions of gender and sexuality, inclusiveness. A very interesting place. And I had wanted to write about the Stanton Street Shul for a long time, but it kept changing so fast that I didn't know how to do it. Finally, I decided, okay, we still have a daily morning minyan. There are a bunch of interesting characters. I'm going to spend the summer there and take really good notes and just try to make a snapshot of the place. And in 2011, I was able to produce this book, Mornings at the Stanton Street Shul, A Summer on the Lower East Side, which is my journal of the morning minyan over the course of a summer, but also recounts the changes over 30 years. So shul is, of course, one part of Jewish life. But another major part, as you know, is learning. And shortly after I started going to the Stanton Street Shul, in the early 1980s, as somebody who'd grown up in a very richly Jewish environment, but certainly not gone to yeshiva, not gotten that traditional education, I wanted to learn how to learn. And when I say learn, I'm using the verb in the Yiddish sense, studying traditional texts. Somebody told me that there was a beginner's men's, certainly men's only, study group in the big Beis Medrash, or study hall, that I'm going to be showing you in a minute, at this building, which is Mesivtha Tifereth Jerusalem, or MTJ, at 145 East Broadway. I went there for a couple years. I participated in that group and did some writing about it and loved it from about 83 to 85, 84 to 86. And then I did other things. I became a lawyer, I became a professor, and I really hadn't been back inside there through those double doors on the left more than a couple of times in about a quarter of a century. And then in the fall of 2011, I was talking to this gentleman, who is Rabbi Yisachar Ginsburg, who is the principal of the lower school at MTJ, at the yeshiva there. I was in shul with him, and I was explaining that I had a year's leave from my university position coming up, and I wasn't sure how I was going to spend the time. And the first thing he said to me was, "Wow, you have a job where they're giving you a year off with pay? I got the wrong job." Then he said, "Well, why don't you go to the Rosh Yeshiva's shir? That is, why don't you attend the daily Talmud lesson of the man who then and for decades was the head of MTJ?" He was talking about, I guess, my other Rebbe, I have to say now, Reb David Feinstein. I have to say Zatzal, of blessed memory now. The son of Reb Moshe Feinstein, whose name you may have heard, who was came to the United States from the Soviet Union in 1936, and until his death in 1986 was acknowledged as probably the leading Orthodox decisor, expert on Jewish law in the world. Reb David, the elder son, was also a world-leading halachic authority on many issues, but also, in many ways, a very private person. Just a few months ago, we observed Reb David's first yortzeit. He passed away last year at age 91. One of the things that's interesting about MTJ is the way they sustain something that I call like a middle orthodoxy. It's definitely not a modern Orthodox yeshiva. It's also not hyper-traditionalist. It's a place where a broad range, again, as the tradition has it, only males can come together and study. Full-time, part-time, old or young, with or without rabbinic titles, and carrying on Reb Moshe Feinstein's legacy of disciplined openness in that respect. I'm going to show you the next picture, and then I'll have to explain it, why it's connected to what I just said about Reb David Feinstein. This photograph is the only illustration in the book that I'm talking about tonight. You see cake, you see some siddurim, some prayer books, you see a table with some commercially baked cake out on it, and a notice. I see Rabbi Mendelson smiling. The point is that one of the interesting things about Reb Moshe's legacy was that he was famous for not insisting that Orthodox Jews, that his followers, could only eat dairy products that were Chalav Yisrael, following certain strictures about being produced by Jews. And at MTJ, they still honor Reb Moshe's ruling on that and his legacy. However, most of the people who come into MTJ and study there regularly now do observe that stricture of Chalav Yisrael. So in order to respect Reb Moshe, but also not confuse people. They left the cake out with a notice that if you're following Chalav Yisrael, maybe you shouldn't eat it. But Rav Moshe would say it's fine to do so. And so I entered. Here's a nice shot of gives you a little sense of the sort of neo-Moorish facade of the building. I went through those big doors and I came in, and that's sorry, somewhat blurry photograph, but yes, that's me in the front. And the gentleman with his back to us in this photograph is Rabbi Shmuel Fischelis, who is the son-in-law of Reb David, and kind of runs the Beis Medrash on a daily basis. And when I came in and looked around, I asked for a certain rabbi who I'd been referred to, and Rabbi Fischelis said to me, "Are you looking for a chavrusa?" Meaning, are you looking for somebody to study with? It's very characteristic that that's the first question that they'd ask you the first day that you walk into MTJ. We'll set you up, we'll get you studying. And then I was privileged for a number of years to be one of the dozen or so people to study with Reb David. You recognize him now because I've shown you his photograph, in the little library room off to the side of the big Beis Medrash. And a number of the people who are characters, who appear as characters in my book, are in this photograph, including the gentleman whom I call Nasanel, and I'll be talking about him in a few minutes. He's standing up toward the back there. And with him and with one other gentleman in this photograph, even though I have not been going to MTJ for the last couple of years, I still study with them on the phone once a week. So I maintain that connection. And somehow I just felt welcomed and at home there, even though in some ways it's not the obvious place for me, even though their standards are not mine. And I knew I was an anthropologist, and I knew I was also an adult Jew. And in the tradition, what an adult Jew is supposed to do when they have the time is study Torah. So sometimes I thought I was doing field work. Sometimes I thought I might write a book. Sometimes I thought I wasn't doing field work. And it never really mattered if I did write a book about it. I had the honor while I was there to complete. If you've ever seen the Art Scroll Talmud, it's very much within that traditional Haredi view, but they've made it possible for an individual who doesn't really know the Hebrew and Aramaic of the original Talmud text very well to study it on her own. So I got through the cycle of the whole Babylonian Talmud with the help of Art Scroll and made what we call a siyum, a celebration, in Reb David's presence and in his honor. So that's a photograph of me with Reb David and with our son Jonah. And you'll forgive me. I know it's a little bit chutzpahdik. Somehow, I think if I told you it's a photograph of a grandfather, a father, and a son, you'd probably believe me. I never developed a close personal relationship with Reb David, although I came to love him and revere him. I think partly because I was aware that in some ways he could be my teacher, but he wouldn't be my rabbi, because I don't follow all of the strictures that he would expect from someone spending that much time in his yeshiva. I did know that at the moment where a couple of years after I started going regularly, where I said to myself, yeah, I probably have enough material to write a book about this place, then my next thought was, I have to ask the Rosh Yeshiva's permission. And along the way, I did ask his permission to write a book. Very much in fear and trembling, I explained to him. I said, I think we referred to him in the third person. This is traditional. We would say, would the Rosh Yeshiva like a drink? Is the Rebbe ready to talk now? I said, probably the Rebbe knows that I'm a professor. That's how I earn my living, and probably the Rebbe understands that to get a job like that, you have to publish a book, and then to advance in an academic career, you publish another book, and then you reach a certain point where they can't fire you if you don't publish any more books, but continuing to publish is part of doing it in a proper way. And I wrote a book about my synagogue, and now I would like, with the Rebbe's permission, to write a book about the yeshiva. And you know what he said? He said, why not? But characteristically, and this also reflects on his father, who was very concerned in his halachic decisions with the idea that Jews had to be able to make a living. The one question that Reb David asked me was, what does it have to do with your parnasa? I told him I don't make a living from the books, but it is part of doing the job in a proper way. And eventually, in October of 2020, the book came out. I mentioned I want to introduce, before I read just a bit from the book, I want to show you another picture of my friend who, I studied with him on the phone yesterday morning. This is a bit distorted because I didn't get the dimensions right, but here's a sweet picture. You might recognize that's who I'm calling Nasano, explaining a point of Jewish law to Rafi, the Dominican janitor, and I just thought it was a sweet picture. Now, I say Nasano, it's not his real name. I followed the anthropological convention of changing the names of my major characters, but I had to be very careful about what I wrote because I couldn't disguise MTJ. I couldn't say it's on Henry Street. It wouldn't have helped. It's the only yeshiva on the Lower East Side. And part of what I wanted to write about is why it is a very unique place. So I had to be very careful about what I wrote about people. Nasano is a bit unusual for MTJ. He's college educated. He loves to read secular history and literature. He has all kinds of theories about relating, for example, when we studied the laws of forbidden mixtures in agriculture, somehow he related it to Sun Tzu's The Art of War. I can't quite reproduce that now. But in some ways, he was also, even though the most curious and worldly of the people I studied with closely, he was the most interested in, so to speak, converting me, as we'll hear. And now I'm going to just read for about a page and a half, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So in the course of a certain conversation, Nasanal said something about Baalei Tshuva. That means penitence. He added, meaning no disrespect, thus suggesting that I would assume he was thinking of me as someone who fit this category of returnees to the practice of halachic Judaism. I fired back without thinking much. I'm not a Baal Tshuva. Nasanal then, and later when the two of us were sitting together, remonstrated that Baal Tshuva is a badge of honor. As the Talmud says, in the place where the Baal Tshuva stands, even the most righteous among us cannot stand. Now, doubtless my knee-jerk response made it sound like I didn't want to be tarred with that label. Later, I finally said to him, but very quietly, I'm not a Baal Tshuva because I don't have charota, mean meaning remorse. So Nasanel said, yes, the Rambam, Maimonides, does require remorse if you're going to be a Baal Tshuva. Nasanel's goals of making me a scholar and making me a Torah Jew appear sometimes in tandem, sometimes in tension with each other. One Sunday morning, none of my other regular study partners were available to me. And since the Shir, the Rosh Yeshiva's Talmud lesson, is only held from Monday through Thursday, we didn't have a Shir to prepare for that day either. Nasanel and I took the opportunity to study together from around 10:40 a.m. until noon, an unusually long stretch for us. And we actually got through a good deal of complicated material. He goes a bit faster than I can follow, though I chalk it up to reading practice. Right? At least I'm reading Hebrew, even if I don't understand it. Still, he consistently finds points in the text we're studying to hammer home the larger lessons he seemingly wants sometimes just to articulate to himself, and sometimes to convey to me. Often he pushes me to ask, why? Why is the halacha this way or that? What is the larger theological or philosophical point? Rather than just continuing to play it safe with the what, a more neutral stance that doesn't require me to decide between my academic and yeshivish views. At one point, he returned to the theme of sibling rivalry. Nasanel knew that my older brother Daniel is a leading academic Talmudist, and had earlier made much of my presumed envy of my brother's learning and reputation, mostly because he wants me to think less like my brother and more like himself, although he might say he wants me to think more for my own self. He framed the question of sibling rivalry or influence in terms of the masters these two disciples might follow. My brother, he knew, studied with Professor Saul Lieberman, a product of the Lithuanian yeshiva system, whose works were effectively banned in the yeshiva world because he taught at the conservative Jewish theological seminary. By contrast, Nasanel fervently wants me to be more fully devoted to our Rosh Yeshiva. I told Nasanel, I'm here, meaning, what more do you want from me? Yes, he said, part of you is here, but I want to convert the rest of you. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I hope that gives you at least enough context to be able to picture the place and a little bit of a sense of what draws me to it. And I'm really ready to hear your thoughts and your questions now.
So I'm happy to open things up to questions if you want to raise your hand, or just let me know in the chat and then I'll call on you. I'm just going to ask the first question, and that, Professor, what is your what are you hoping to? What's the message you want people to take away from your book?
Well, first of all, Alyssa, again, as I said, I lived on the Lower East Side for 40 years. And Alyssa and I knew from the moment we landed there that it was shrinking, and that it had been shrinking since the 1920s. Right? That's not something new. This is a very long-term compression. But we also had the sense that there were things that were precious there, that were both very characteristic of an immigrant and working class and intimate world, very aware of the rich and varied political and social history of the Jewish Lower East Side, but also aware that what had survived institutionally and in terms of actual collective social life was mostly the Orthodox institutions and stores and so forth. And especially within the immigrant generations. I mean, you all know some of this. There's a sensibility and an idiom that is very distinctive and is kind of lost like a language. So some of what I do is just salvage ethnography, right? 10 years from now, I hope MTJ will be flourishing, but it won't be the same place, and it would not be possible to capture this snapshot. So some of it is just memorialization. But a lot of what I focus on, I think also is kind of an attack at once on the idea that there's this necessary divide between two worlds. One of them is religious and one of them is secular. And especially an attack on the idea that people who are Orthodox are living in the medieval period. So I try to show that there is something special about the sense of time at MTJ, perhaps most sharply in contrast to my academic universe, where, especially as you're coming up and trying to get established, it's all about production. In the yeshiva, you don't have to produce anything. You just have to be there and do it. It is, I mean, for some people, and the ideology is this way, there's a notion that you're collecting mitzvahs, right? In this life, and it's your only chance to collect mitzvahs, and it will affect your life in the world to come. That's kind of muted at MTJ. There's the sense that this is what we're supposed to be doing, and that it's the most delightful thing that a Jew could be doing. So I wrote a couple of more specialized pieces, and one of them is called "Not Spending Time" at Mesivtha Tifereth Jerusalem, a place where we don't think of time as money. And to convey in certain moments the exhilaration when you forget about time, and especially when you're studying with others and just trying to make sense of the text and join the conversation that's been going on for centuries. That's a very special feeling. And then, as I say, to show that people can participate in that sensibility, and it doesn't mean they're not in the contemporary world. It doesn't mean that they don't have, family concerns and views on politics and so forth. The fact is that those political views, more often than not, much more often than not, were diametrically opposed to mine. But that also is not an insuperable barrier for my belonging there and participating and enjoying it.
Although had you were able to enjoy it also because you're a man. And,
Absolutely. This is absolutely true, and I'm aware of that. And one of the things I say in the beginning of the book is that I'm not going to have a lot to say about a salient issue where the views of the secular academy, the views of the academy, and the views of the yeshiva on gender roles are so far apart that I really can't have much to say about it in this book. When people ask me about this question, one thing that I say that's maybe a little bit defensive and not necessarily adequate is that I wouldn't have designed the system that way, but I didn't design the system. And also to point out that there are an increasing number of alternative venues for very serious study, and often using the same traditional methods without these gender restrictions. At a place like Hadar on the Upper West Side, which is egalitarian. At a place like Drisha, which is, I don't know if Drisha is only women's now, but was opened as a women's serious study program. At at Sfara in Chicago, which is a queer yeshiva. And now I saw a mailing from it, and I don't know. There's a I don't know if they call it a yeshiva, but there's a serious Torah study house specifically for Jews of color in Brooklyn, and that is all to be celebrated. I just saw a question in the chat that I'll answer. Why did we leave our long-term residence? I had a long list of reasons at the time we were moving. The most facetious, humorous, and almost entirely facetious one was that our seltzer man wasn't delivering anymore, so there was no particular reason for staying. Marty the seltzer man had been continuing to come to us for decades, and he's a great character, and we could tell you lots of Marty the seltzer man stories. Honestly, I felt that the what was special to us about the Lower East Side, and not just the Jewish Lower East Side, was still there and precious, but shrinking continually. I told people, I live in the same neighborhood, but it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And also, frankly, long-term concerned about the city's what we thought inadequate plans for storm surge control. And so when we were considering moving, we looked for higher ground, and we wound up in Washington Heights. And we're about a block away from the highest point on Manhattan Island at this point. It happens to be also a neighborhood where our older son lives. So that was a big draw. I see a bunch of questions in the chat, Alyssa.
Yeah. So I'm gonna read them out. Let's see. So
Yeah.
Okay. The question you just answered was, why did you and your wife leave your longtime residence? And the follow-up, I think, from Marcia and Mark is, how did your wife feel about this moving? And Marcia, Marcia and Mark, maybe will you just ask your own questions, because I'm not quite sure. They also want to know where you were raised, where you grew up, kind of
Okay.
what led you. So they want to know about your journey.
Oh, okay. I can do that.
Word, but
I can do that.
Inquiring minds want to know. And then Marcia, just ask your other question, and then we'll turn it back to the professor.
Yeah, no, my first question was actually, how did your wife feel about your spending the time here that, of course, she was not permitted to participate in?
Yeah, good. Mixed. Probably thought that it was good that I had a routine. She was much happier about it when it did look like a fieldwork project, when it did look part of my part of my academic work than when it didn't. She has her own very serious scholarly interests. Overall, she knows vastly more about the Lower East Side's social history than I do, and she's especially interested in labor and radical history. She's a geographer, and when we got to Cornell, she discovered that the archives of the American Jewish Communists, the International Workingmen's Order, and the Jewish People's Fraternal Order are at Cornell. And she has been very happily going through them for the past few years and become an expert on the immigrant Jewish left. I think that there were two aspects of what I was doing and how I was writing about it and how I was talking about the yeshiva that did particularly trouble Alyssa. One was that, as anthropologists often do and must, I didn't tell half of what I knew. And I could have produced a portrait that was not as loving and not as gentle. And because of neighborhood Jewish politics and ways in which, frankly, the Rosh Yeshiva had, to our lights, disappointed the community in earlier years, she this also troubled her. And it also troubled her that I didn't say more about the women of the families, the spouses for the most part, of the men that I studied with, which is legitimate, but also has to do with precisely the fact that they're not there. And I'm not writing about this as a whole community. I'm writing about the experience of studying there. I didn't interview anybody. I didn't say which yeshiva. Sometimes I found out, but I didn't say which yeshivas do you go to. I never said, how do you sustain a household on a stipend of $700 or $1,000 a month? I knew that in most cases the answer was either there are in-laws, wealthy in-laws, parents, or more frequently a spouse who is both running the household and has very frequently a position as a speech therapist, a physical therapist. That sort of range of professions are common for women in these communities. So this is a point of tension. Absolutely. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of where you grew up, how your Jewish identity has developed over time?
Excuse me. Yeah.
God bless you.
Yeah. Yes. I've written about this too, and in some ways, while I hope I'm not overly narcissistic, my ethnographic record is my autobiography. I was born into a family of Jewish chicken farmers. Probably some of you knew some Jewish chicken farmers, but these were in Farmingdale, New Jersey, sort of Monmouth County, near Lakewood, if that's a familiar name, and into a very intimate community of pretty much all Ashkenazi Jews, all running single-family chicken farms, politically ranging from Orthodox to Zionist to Communist and everything in between, and not necessarily harmonious, often very contentious, but all there in one community. That was a very important early lesson for me. And I was one of the youngest children of that community, and it fell apart in my early childhood. So I had an early experience of loss of Jewish community, especially when I was 10 years old and we moved away from there to a much blander, to me, much more alienated and racially segregated suburb not far away near Asbury Park. By the time I was in high school, I was very cynical about conservative Judaism. I said, gosh, it's a shame after thousands of years it has to come to this, but I don't see any future for it. And then I went to college in the Pacific Northwest, and for the first time in my life, suddenly was in a situation where there weren't a lot of Jews around. And after a year there, I looked around, and nearly all of my friends were Jewish. And that's not surprising in retrospect, but it wasn't something I'd anticipated. And I said to myself, oh, I guess I'm pretty Jewish. I don't know what to do with that. And something in my childhood in particular had given me a longing for Yiddish and for a sense of what East European Jewish life had been like. So when I graduated, I moved to New York and I went to graduate school in anthropology, and I started studying Yiddish at YIVO and lived on the Lower East Side and wrote about that. And Alyssa and I spent a year in Paris. I wrote a book about my dissertation about elderly Polish Jewish immigrants in Paris. I got to practice my Yiddish there. And I would say a lot of my work in the past decade or so, particularly, has been just picking up the literacy in the traditional text, learning in that traditional sense, and not necessarily because it's the next phase of my academic career, but because I've really come to love it. And it's also, as I get older and as I approach retirement, it's a wonderful feeling to have the sense that there is a a library there and an ongoing discussion for centuries that I can participate in for as long as I have sense and breath, and certainly won't exhaust it. So that's been very gratifying.
I wanted to say, to ask you two questions. First, I wanted to say that I did get a total chuckle out of the idea of the whoever it was who wrote down that, the cake was
Yes.
OUD, but it wasn't, it was like this, it has this texture, but it doesn't have that texture.
Right.
And so if you eat this texture, but you don't eat that texture, that's okay. And that makes me laugh because that's such a reform Jewish thing to do, in a sense. It's like, this is your choice and I'm okay with you making your choice, as opposed to what I would perceive as a more halachically observant way of approaching it, which is, this is the one we eat, that's the one we don't eat.
Right.
And there is no, so it did make me laugh. Just I mean, it's funny that they even had to say it, but of course but I was really amazed that they were given that
there's that space.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would not have expected that in a yeshiva.
Yeah.
And certainly not in that yeshiva.
Right. I'll slip in one more example. One point during the shir, Reb David was talking about Rashi, the commentator Rashi, and he said, the real frummies call him der Heilige Rashi. The ones who are really, really pious call him Holy Rashi, right? And then he said, and we should too, right? Right? He said we should too, but he was saying, there's people who consider themselves really, really pious. I just love that sensibility.
And as the rabbi of a Reform synagogue, and we often are looking at Orthodox Judaism and halakhically observant Jews, and we talk about the question, what is legitimate Judaism, right? Like, right. Is there a difference? Is my Judaism any less legit, as it were, to Reb David's, and really, aren't we all making, I believe, as a Reform rabbi, that Judaism is an ever evolving, tradition where we make informed choices about how we practice, period. And right. I would say that in some ways the cake is a perfect example of that, right? And yet, we're so far apart. So right. My other question though is that my teacher, Rabbi and Professor Larry Hoffman, when he talks about Judaism and Jewish practice and Jewish life, he describes the world that I grew up in. I was born in 1972. And, and my parents, when my parents were growing up, and they were born in the 1940s, I think, that, they were growing up in Brooklyn, like you were growing up in Lakewood and in the Bronx, and they were growing up in communities where like Judaism and Jewish practice and Jewish life was just in the air.
Right.
They had they had the touch with their immigrant grandparents and the practices of the old country.
That's right.
And so I'm like the last, my kids don't have that connection the way I did. Like my grandma still spoke Yiddish. So I'm just thinking about, what you wrote about and the idea that, you talked about capturing this moment in time and looking at, the life of the yeshiva, and also as somebody who's in the academy and teaching kids, at Cornell, and, presumably mostly Jewish kids, and, what that's like, and, what you see as, how you think about those two experiences, side by side.
I think that mostly the thought that comes to my mind in response to what you've just said is that when I was much younger, I envisaged myself as an old Jewish storyteller. said, when I want to grow into a storyteller. And I've reached the point where even in my academic career, a lot of my teaching is storytelling. And I have to be careful because I don't want to tell the same people the same story too many times, without being aware of it. But I know also that for me, as a student, the lessons that I retained were so often contained in stories. And I really think that I'm not just taking it easy, I'm passing on the most precious things I have when I explain something through a personal anecdote. So I'll tell you all a story, a short story now. My mother, was from, well, my mother's father was the stepson of a Rosh Yeshiva in Lithuania. And he, my grandfather, left as a young man just before World War I, according to my mother, partly because he didn't want to grow up to be a Rosh Yeshiva. He didn't want to be confined to that world, although he wasn't rebelling against it either. And she told me once, presumably after I started learning Yiddish, because I wouldn't have understood this otherwise, she told me that her father had once told her a memory that he had when he was back in Lithuania as a little boy or a young man, walking with one of his teachers and watching some kids, I guess Jewish kids, running around and playing. And the teacher, that is the teacher of my mother's father, when my mother's father was a child, said to my mother's father, my grandfather, "Und was wollt gewinn schlecht, eben mir haben a Sprung getan." Maybe a few of you understand that. It means, and what would it have hurt if we got to run around a little bit?
Yeah,
Meaning,
I understood that.
yeah, good. Meaning that teacher was reflecting on his own childhood and saying, gosh, we were confined inside with the books all the time, and they never let us run around. It's very poignant, but it's especially precious to me because it is an oral tradition of a memory that at this point probably goes back to about 1850 or 1860. So if I tell that story to my students at Cornell and a couple of them retain it, they can keep it going. And that's the most precious thing I have at this point, I think.
There was one last question, and I don't know if anyone has any other last questions. That's a really beautiful way of actually ending things up. But somebody asked, "Are you still participating in Talmud study?" And I would, and I would say, "Do you ever drop in on MTJ?" And
yeah, the answer to the first question is absolutely. And as I mentioned briefly, I mean, I study on my own. I'm better at it than I was 10 years ago. I'm still not as good as I could be, but unlike 10 years ago, I can pick up a volume of the Talmud with no translation and make some sense of it, right? I couldn't teach it to you, but I don't feel like I'm just completely blind in there. In addition, I have about 5 different weekly study partner sessions with different study partners in different texts by phone or by Zoom, some of them from the academic world, some of them from MTJ. And the answer to the second part is, part of the reason I wrote this book the way I did was because I didn't want to lose my connection to MTJ. And I knew that if I was going to write a book about it, I only wanted to publish a book that I could show to people there and then still come back and be welcomed. And it came out already almost a year into the time when it was impossible for health reasons to go there. And gosh, I hope in a few weeks it'll feel safe. Now, I have to tell you, these, for the most part, these are people, I don't know if they're vaccinated. I know they haven't been masking. We've been much more careful than that on both fronts. So I still want to go back. I still maintain the connection. I still stay in touch. And yes, I do still study.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think, it's a beautiful like tip of the iceberg in terms of, I think, what we will discover in your book, Yeshiva Days, which was published by, I think, the Princeton University Press. Everyone here, just so you know, I will send you a link so that if you'd like to order it through Amazon, you can. Of course, we would prefer that you order it through your local bookstore here in Port Washington.
I agree.
Yes. So in Port Washington, it's the Dolphin, and we have friends here, not just from Port Washington, but from other places in the country. And so we hope that you'll call your local bookstore and ask them to order it for you. And I think, a really interesting sequel would be, finding an incredible female anthropologist, or maybe just asking your wife and interviewing the wives of all of these Talmud scholars. And it would be really fascinating, I think, to see the other side of that story.
You betcha.
I can't help myself but suggest it because, of course, I'm always wanting. I'm completely fascinated. You are able to give me, and you are able to give me and every woman here and anyone else, but insight into a world I would not be welcome into, and I'm really grateful for that and very interested in it. And I, of course, want to hear the other part of the story too. With that being said, thank you so much for spending time with us and for allowing us to learn with you. It was totally fascinating. And I just want to remind people that we have in the month of March, two great authors coming to speak to us. Helene Wecker, who wrote The Golem and the Jinni, is coming to speak to us about her new book. Yeah, pretty exciting. And she's coming to speak to us about The Hidden Palace, her new book. And Anne Seba is coming to talk to us about her book, Ethel Rosenberg, which is a biography of Ethel Rosenberg. Thank you so much. Please be safe, and look for my email, which will have a link also to this talk. So if you enjoyed it and you want to send it to a friend who you think would enjoy watching it, you'll be able to just send them the link, the YouTube link, and they can just click on it and watch it there too. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you again, Professor Boyarin. Stay warm, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Good night.